Good morning to our viewers in the United States, and good afternoon to our viewers in Europe. I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this webinar on Europe's energy issues. Across Europe, countries are facing crises in their oil, gas, and electricity markets. EU member states are struggling to rein in soaring gas prices, which have been wreaking havoc across the continent. And last week, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz called for a European intervention to control gas prices in the run-up to a meeting of Europe's energy ministers, which was held last Friday in Brussels. At the meeting, the ministers discussed a collection of proposals by the European Commission to tackle rising energy prices. And just yesterday, the EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen gave her annual State of the European Union address. And in it, she also talked about how to deal with high energy prices. To help us understand Europe's energy conundrum, we're joined today by America Hernandez. She's Politico's energy policy correspondent and has been covering Europe's energy market. America, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So before we get into the details of Friday's meeting and President von der Leyen's speech, I thought maybe you could start by painting a picture in broad brushstrokes of the energy situation across Europe. Many of our viewers are familiar with the situation in Germany, but I thought you could help us put what's going on in Germany into a broader European context.
Absolutely. So I think the first big pillar to kind of focus on is that Russia has historically provided Europe with 40% of its natural gas, which is, historically high, very difficult to replace. And we're now about to enter the fall and the winter heating season, essentially not being able to count on that supply at all. So, as with all, shall we say, regime change, there's this kind of scramble where everybody looks around and decides, where do I stand? And I think for Germany specifically, the realization is that, previously they were the first in line to get the gas coming east to west, very, very cheap prices. And now there's this kind of stock taking where they say, well, wait a minute, if we've got to switch to gas coming from Norway, gas coming from the US, suddenly if it's coming west to east or another route, they may not necessarily be first in line anymore. They may be last in line. And, the financial implications of no longer having cheap access to a plentiful resource is really kind of the panic backdrop for this coming winter. So that's kind of been the baseline that's set all of these how do we say, unexpected changes, I would say. I never would have expected Germany to say, for example, we're going to keep our nuclear plants running longer. I never would have expected to hear, like we heard yesterday, the head of the European Union saying, our electricity and our gas markets, we're going to change the formulas, we're going to change the way prices are formed. So there's a lot of tumult going on, a lot of flux. But I think it's still an open question, for how long will this panic allow, these changes to actually happen? For now, we're kind of in the talking stage, what can be done. But it'll be curious, as the temperature drops, as we get further into winter and see how well we're faring, what was more the panic rising in the throat as far as what we're willing to do and what changes may endure.
So as you sort of look across Europe, obviously this is challenging countries throughout the continent, throughout the European Union. But are there any countries that have been sort of navigating the situation better than others? And if so, what do you think has contributed to that?
So it depends who you ask, non-answer to the question. But there are definitely some countries that have reacted well in terms of reducing how much gas and how much energy they consume. I'm thinking of Denmark, I'm thinking of the Netherlands, as soon as the rationing word kind of bubbled up over the summer, there were countries that said, well, we've already reduced our energy, by 1/3 this year, we're going to be just fine. Other countries, I would say notably Spain, have taken a very different approach, and they've gotten permission from the EU to do this. They've chosen to partially subsidize the price of gas as it regards the electricity price. Realize it's a little complex, but they've gotten permission to intervene. And in that kind of theme of gas no longer flowing east to west, I would say that everyone on the periphery, which has access to an offshore terminal, is now suddenly, the beautiful person at the ball that everybody wants to dance with. Spain, for example, has, I'd say, I mean, they're awash in LNG, right? Liquefied natural gas, which comes on ships. And it's interesting to see the way the politics change, because for years, they weren't able to get that Russian gas that would go to Germany, then to France. It just didn't trickle down. So they had to overspend. They had to build all these terminals off their coastlines. And now they kind of have a chip on their shoulder because they did the work. They're now in a really great position. And now everybody's looking to them saying, hey, you want to send some of that this way? And they're saying, oh, well, now you suddenly care, that we can help you. So as far as price, as far as supply, as far as savings, I think those are the three levers that governments are activating, and some are finding themselves in better situations than previously once the pipelines have kind of been knocked out.
So if we're able to, in the course of the conversation, I'd like to come back a little later to Spain, because I was reading a little bit of news about both Spain and Portugal, and how they might actually serve as models for the rest of Europe. But maybe we can come back to that, because A, there are a couple of other issues that you raised that I think are well worth discussing, and B, I want to get into the ministerial meeting and also the speech by Ursula von der Leyen. You said that you would not have expected Germany to keep its three remaining, or two of its three remaining nuclear reactors online. And it's interesting that you said that, because for the first 9 months of this year, we had many speakers from Germany, from across the political spectrum, right? I mean, conservative Christian Democrats, then also more liberal social Democrats, even Greens and Free Democrats, all of whom were vehement in their response to the many questions that they received from Americans about whether or not Germany would keep these reactors online for a longer period of time. And they, across the board said, absolutely not. This is not going to happen. And here we are, sort of 2 stress tests later, and they weren't exactly wrong, but they also weren't exactly right. My understanding is that 2 of the 3 reactors are supposed to be sort of kept on in reserve if they're needed until the middle of April of next year. But it's not as if they're really going to stay online and contribute to Germany's energy needs in the meantime. But this has created a whole new debate around nuclear power in Germany, and whether or not it makes sense to be thinking about new generation nuclear reactors or not. And I'm hearing sort of different things about that. Some people are saying that they're certainly looking into it, sort of looking at the science, trying to figure out what the future might hold for smaller reactors. But others have really been very clear, including the co-chair of the German Green Party, Ricarda Lang, that this is not a long-term solution, and that nuclear power is a big no in Germany, even though it's used in neighboring countries like France and the Czech Republic. What do you think the future holds when it comes to nuclear power for Europe?
So keeping aside, shall we say, maybe the political opposition or the ideological arguments that are very intense in certain countries and in certain parties, I think just the fact that France, which has, I believe, 56 nuclear reactors, they're very clear this is the path that they want to continue taking. So the nuclear industry of Europe will survive. France will invest both in classic reactors and in what you referenced. We call them SMRs, small modular reactors. So the idea being that we take something huge, we'll make it small, and the idea would be if we can mass produce them on a factory. I think that's the goal, because the big criticism that you hear with nuclear, aside from radioactive waste, we don't know where we're going to store it. It's very expensive to build a plant, but once you've got it up and running, just letting it produce the electricity is very cheap. So as far as, maintaining the existing fleet, the investments were made decades ago. Why not benefit from that pollution-free, emissions-free electricity? And it's interesting that, even countries such as Italy, which said no quite vehemently to nuclear, they've got a new minister of the ecological transition and energy who said, we should talk about this whole small modular reactor thing. So there's definitely already what we would call PowerPoint reactors, right? They've been put together for presentations for the 2030 market. The idea being we're going to turn off our coal plants, and at the same time we'll be able to introduce these small reactors. But it's anyone's guess at this point, whether they'll work, whether they're going to have a real future. Some people say no, it's going to be more hydrogen, it's going to be more batteries, storing electricity from wind and solar. But currently, I think, as far as the future of nuclear, it's more in Russia, in China. Those are really the countries that are building and building a lot and building quickly. So it will be needed. Even the International Energy Agency says, you can't reach the goal of a climate neutral 2050 without nuclear. But I think there's quite a step between, as you say, temporarily extending the runtime, let's say in Germany. Belgium is also thinking about this, and building a new multi-billion euro plant from scratch.
Thank you. Thanks. So I'd now sort of like to shift gears a little bit and get sort of your take on Ursula von der Leyen's speech, but also on last week's meeting of the European energy ministers. You had a piece earlier in the week where you wrote that the Commission is under a lot of pressure to come up with some quick fixes to the high energy prices. And you point out that that's great from a European level, but there's lack of consensus among the member states on the details. Can you, as part of your sort of analysis of what von der Leyen said and of last week's meeting, talk a little bit about some of the proposals and why there are these different national viewpoints on how to address the challenges?
Sure. As to that last question, I think the reason that there are so many viewpoints is, every country is in a different position. Some people are blessed with a lot of wind, a lot of sun, others not so much. Some have a lot of seaports where they can, bring in gas from the US, from other jurisdictions. Others a little landlocked, getting a little nervous ahead of the winter. From speaking with diplomats, from speaking with assistants to ministers, in some cases the energy ministers themselves, there were two emotions, I think, that rose to the top of the agenda last week. That was one, a sense of urgency. Governments will fall faster than the Commission is actually what one told me. So there's this feeling that, from the point of view of citizen X, who is worried about their bills, doing their year-end budget, am I going to be able to turn on my heating this winter? There's that pressure to ensure that person that not only will they be able to heat their home, but that they will still have a job, right? If gas is expensive, how are you going to keep your economy going? So that kind of panic is there. But there was also a sense of, let's come together and let's figure out a solution, even if it's a short-term measure, even if it will just calm people's down in their minds. But what was so striking was that, and it's just for people who don't know how Brussels works, I found this quite interesting because a lot of documents kind of leak out ahead of time. So you get a sense of the backstage coordination. Last week, the Commission was already circulating some proposals to the countries. And so the countries were able to see, what was coming down the line, and they were able to organize themselves to say, we would welcome it if you proposed X, knowing full well that the Commission was going to propose X. So there's a lot of kind of dress rehearsal preparation going on. And what was finally mentioned by Commission President Ursula von der Leyen yesterday were a few, shall we say, palliative measures. They're going to make a cash grab. They say it's not a tax, it's not a tax. We don't need unanimity of all the countries, it's not a tax. But we're going to impose a levy on the excess profits of certain companies that may have profited from these record energy prices. And we're going to encourage countries to redistribute this in some way, either through lowering bills, whatever they may see fit. But that doesn't really attack the root of the problem, right? Which is that gas prices are high. Why are gas prices high? Because we've lost a lot of supply. And when you wait till the last minute and there's a run on supply, it's not the best time to stock up before winter.
Right.
So she laid out, I'd say 3 or 4 measures that generally everybody's getting behind. One is a sort of post-transaction tax every time traders sell electricity on the market. So, if there's a coal plant in Germany that offers to provide this much electricity tomorrow at noon, and everybody wants this electricity, it's going to be very expensive. They'll get to make their sale, but as soon as that sale is done, everything over 180, euros per megawatt hour, they'll have to turn over to the German government, and then the German government would be able to, decide how best to mitigate that very expensive, energy, either for homes, for small businesses. So grabbing that extra off the markets, essentially, for electricity. Then they want to look at the oil and gas companies and the refineries and say, well, oil and gas prices are very high. I think you should contribute something as well. So if it passes, because it's a draft proposal at this point, what they're looking at doing in the EU is comparing the profits of oil and gas companies from 2019, 2020, 2021. Looking at 2022, they're going to kind of skim a little bit off the top of that, what they would consider to be windfall excess. And again, that would go to the national government at this point in time, which would then be able to redistribute it. So a lot of these, as you can tell, are more taking money from one side and re-injecting it back to the population or to the small businesses. They want to make it easier to trade. There's a lot of concern that there's panic, that there's liquidity problems. This is a term you hear a lot. Basically, when you trade on these markets, after the 2008 crash, they wanted to avoid a situation where you win the bid and then you can't afford to pay. So you've got to put up collateral. Problem is, I have a window open. If you give me a second, I'm going to look at what the wholesale gas prices right now in Europe. Okay, so we're at 218 euros per megawatt hour, and just to give you a reference, a year ago was about 30 euros per megawatt hour.
Wow.
So if you can imagine, you want to buy this much gas for your client at 30 versus at 217. Not only is the amount of money you've got to have on hand or credit just astronomical, but the collateral that you've got to put on there is also has gone up by the same percentage. So an idea that everybody has gotten behind, but that hasn't been proposed in a text is, well, let's ease those collateral rules. Let's make it easier to trade, because utilities that no longer have access to Russian gas need to buy that gas on the market. It's very expensive, and their credit lines are maxed out. So there is an intense desire to help utilities from this point of view, but there's a concern from the financial regulators that, hold on, those rules were put in after 2008 for a reason. Let's not throw all of our trader protections, market protections out the window. So those are kind of the top line. Everybody agrees on a solution. There are 2 more radical things that increasingly is getting a lot of support from countries, but are areas where the European Commission historically has said, forget about it, we're not going there. You will have heard, I think a week ago, Ursula von der Leyen had proposed capping the price of Russian gas. She didn't really mention that yesterday when she spoke again.
Which was sort of surprising, right?
Yes, and I think the key was that, in between, the EU's 27 national energy ministers met behind closed doors, and they talked about this. And it seemed that several inconvenient facts kind of rose to the surface, one of which being the percentage of Russian gas still coming into Europe is a dribble of gas compared to what it once was. So if you are talking about the really pricey gas that now needs to be acquired, it's not Russian. So if you just want to cap this little gas over here, it's not really going to bring down the overall bill. And Ursula von der Leyen recognized this in saying it's more a political measure, it's more about showing solidarity with Ukraine. And that just fed the fire, and some ministers were saying it's not going to solve our problems with our citizens, and it could make it worse, because what little gas is still coming from Russia might be shut off, and who knows, how much higher prices would climb. So what was interesting about last week's meeting with the ministers was that actually a majority expressed support for some kind of intervention to bring down the price of all gas. They're fighting over what it would look like. And the difficulty here is this kind of free market liberal ideology that has been the mainstay for the European Commission, for the past 15 plus years, which is you've got supply and demand, you've got buyers and sellers, prices go up, but everything's working. And a lot of those people are still saying the same thing, prices are high, but that's how a market works, right? And I think governments are no longer willing to just sit back and accept that. So Germany has said it's skeptical about, capping the gas price writ large, just sticking its hand in there. But they are open to some, shall we say, minimal tinkering, I would say, about that. There's this growing idea that the hubs, right, the trading exchanges where this buying and selling is taking place, it's not the whole picture. You can pick up the phone privately and you can buy and sell gas. But what German Chancellor Olaf Scholz said the other day correctly was that, if you look at all of our contracts right now, or if you look at the price that's shown on this exchange, it's high because of that pipeline gas from Russia that's no longer coming. So he's saying, why can't we put in a system where we've got a reference price that everybody can put in their contracts, that everybody can reference as, this is the true cost, and have it just be the actual cost of shipping gas, on a boat and arriving at a port somewhere. So it's not, shall we say, Soviet style price controls, right? It's not a direct ripping up the rule book of the market, but it's picking a basket of products, as one would say, that they would argue is more representative of what it would really cost to get all that gas on boats and come here. That is something that the Commission has said it's open to. That is something that a lot of other countries are looking at as well. But there are still, I believe, at least 15 out of the 27 which want some sort of peg or intervention that would actively, lower the going rate of prices, at least for a year, or some sort of temporary measure. So that's something that's totally new, as far as the Commission considering it.
And certainly challenging to sort of navigate and bring to fruition, if you will, because of these different viewpoints. One of the issues that you mentioned a little earlier was the mandatory measures to reduce electricity demand. And one of our viewers is curious about learning a little bit more about that. She writes, one of the Europe-wide aims of energy policy reform is to mandatorily reduce power demand from 10% in general and 5% during peak hours of use. How feasible is this goal? And will all the European states unanimously sign up for this? And how can it be enforced?
Okay. Good question. Just taking the figures down. So will it be unanimous? It doesn't have to be if the Commission gets its way. They're using an emergency procedure. It's called Article 122, if you're a bit of a EU legislative nerd. But essentially the idea is that desperate times call for desperate situations, and they can do qualified majority vote. So I believe that's more than half the countries and more than 65% of the EU population. So you can find little calculators online where you can see, how much each country is worth and kind of game out some options. But they've used it once before, and that was over the summer. They already agreed on a gas demand reduction. And I would actually argue that this measure, which has already been agreed, is more relevant to discussing winter preparedness, because it's actually about, the heating fuel that is most going to be scarce this winter. Now that was passed by a qualified majority vote, so not everybody had to agree, and I think indeed Hungary did not vote in favor, but it will still be affected. And in that case, it was a 15% overall reduction in gas consumption over the winter period. But it's not mandatory. It's, countries will use their best efforts. But if ever there is a union alert, if ever the red emergency button turns on, then it will be mandatory. They say 15%, it's probably going to be closer to 10, just because there's little caveats here and there for everybody. Is it feasible? I would say yes, because as with the gas and with this electricity demand reduction measure, the Commission is very clear. They say governments, first off, governments are in charge of enforcing it. Governments have wide discretion in enforcing it in the best way that they see fit. And that includes being able to pay, shall we say, energy intensive companies to turn off if necessary. So we can save the gas and we can save the electricity. The question is at what cost? Not just cost of how much will it cost us to pay them, but there are some sorts of industries that, once you turn off the furnace, you can never turn it back on. So, glass, ceramics, a lot of other, I think steelworks, I'm actually not sure if they can turn that one back on. But, these are kind of heartland industrial jobs. And so it's very politically sensitive. And then there's the question of, will they decamp to another jurisdiction? Are we deindustrializing Europe? Is that the real political end game here? Is kind of the background conversation that you're hearing in these, more so than simply, can we hit the number target that's been set? Well, I will say that there is one piece of legislation that has been put in place with the goal of never being caught unawares ahead of winter. And that is mandatory gas storage. So earlier this year, I believe it was in the spring, March, April, May, there was this realization that the reason that gas prices went so high was because storage was low, winter was coming, we didn't know if it would last. And so the European Commission essentially decided with the Parliament and the countries to implement mandatory gas storage. And they essentially set some benchmarks throughout the year. And I think for this year, the target is hit 80% gas storage by October 1st. And the idea being, our storage is filled, come what may, we'll be able to last several months at least if everything goes wrong. And that now is going to be in place basically every year. I even think next year it's going to be higher. It's going to be 90% gas storage. So that's definitely one sort of more durable legislative fix that's been put in place. But I think right now there's more, there's a debate on this, because if you want to talk about how to be prepared, you can act on supply, but you need to act on demand. So, 2 years ago, there was this EU initiative called the Renovation Wave. And the idea was that, they would retrofit buildings and houses everywhere just to consume less generally, in line with the climate targets for the European Union, but also just, peak oil, supplies increasingly becoming scarce. We need to all do our part to consume less. So, those are two measures that I think are being reconsidered after the bit of a wake-up call with losing the EU's top supplier. But you said you had two questions. I hope I answered your first one.
Yeah, no, so that was great. I am gonna just turn my camera off to maybe see if that helps with my internet situation and sort of people can think of me as the radio interviewer and or the offstage voice, if you will. But indeed, that was the first question. I guess the second question was, as you follow these developments over the next few weeks, what are the things that you're going to be looking for and watching for that you think our viewers might be interested in following as well?
I think what will be very, very interesting is this conversation on how do we bring gas prices down? Because what happened over the summer when EU governments realized that they couldn't rely on their Russian supply, as contracts were being canceled, et cetera. Everybody kind of ran to the four corners of the globe. People were trying to sign deals with Qatar, with the other kind of OPEC countries. But they wanted to sign on their own terms. And they very quickly realized that this is a seller's market. And so right now, basically, you've got LNG suppliers in the US, you've got pipeline suppliers, Norway, other exporters, and they're very clear. They say, well, it costs us money to produce this. We're not simply willing to kick off our other existing clients to give you what you need now. We need assurances. Give us a long-term contract, give us some stability. Let us know that if we invest now to up our production, you'll still be buying from us in 15 to 20 years. And that's more the classic way of doing business. Unfortunately, the European Commission and the European Union's, member countries have agreed that they want to be net zero climate neutral by 2050. It's been, I think, a decade and a half now that they've been, maybe less than that, actively discouraging long-term contracts for oil and gas. And so it's very difficult to, on one hand, say, we're willing to do whatever it takes. But on the other hand, we have these ideas about how we want our market to work, about how we want our policy to unfold in the coming decades. So the conversations that companies and countries in the EU will be having with Norway, with the United States, with Canada, with Qatar, et cetera, to see what the rules of the game are, what the new rules of the game are in terms of having access to those supplies and in terms of admitting, how long we're going to need them. I recall it was in the beginning of this year, or actually, no, it was soon after the invasion of Ukraine, that Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said, you know what, that's great. We're going to cut our dependence on Russian gas by 2/3. And about 2-3 months went by, and that goal was not met, shall we say. So maybe just a little more clarity on what the goal is, but also what the reality is. And I think that is going to be something that everybody will be watching in sort of geopolitics of energy space this winter. Who gets the goods and what they had to give up to get it.
Yeah, that's super helpful. I think in terms of providing sort of guidelines for people to be watching in the weeks ahead. Thinking about European energy policy, one of our viewers is curious as to whether there might be any lessons to be learned from U.S. energy policy at either the state or the federal level for Germany, but also for other countries in Europe in trying to address the unfolding energy crisis that we're seeing.
What I have heard is that part of the problem, according to some market watchers today in Europe, is that the EU sort of copy-pasted what American energy markets worked like, even though they didn't necessarily have the same domestic context that would have made it the best choice. For example, right now in the US, you guys have the shale revolution. You guys can make your own and pull out of the ground your oil and gas. There's a real sort of liquid intra-continent trading situation. You've got the wildcatters. You can just go out there and buy some cheap land and see if they can strike black gold. And in Europe, they've sort of adopted the similar kind of wholesale gas market trading scenario where they thought, yeah, everything's going to be liquid and real time, and we're going to be able to see the price rise and fall. But domestic production has just been declining. So there's not that sort of, let's say, domestic oil and gas well that normally would undergird it. And this is kind of an aside, but I think that it's something that can't be ignored in the conversation, which is that in Europe, they're kind of surrounded by all these great producers, right? I mean, Russia, North Africa, the Nordic countries. And so they've got the pipelines, and they had for a long time played their strength, which was sign a long-term contract and, receive from the oases that surround you. But in wanting to move to this more American market system, and in wanting to, supply themselves on the real-time market, they're essentially kind of the desert right now in the middle of the oases. So that's kind of the one thing that I'm hearing the most, as far as maybe not lessons that the US can give to Europe, but rather maybe they should not have copy pasted this so quickly, because their situations were a bit different.
So that's actually a perfect segue to sort of come back to Portugal and Spain.
America, I have the question that he was going to ask.
Okay, great.
To you. So I think he was saying he read an article earlier this month in the New York Times talking about how Portugal could hold an answer for how Europe is captive to Russian gas. And that both Portugal and Spain have built a system based on imports and on solar. They've invested heavily in renewable resources like wind, solar, and hydropower. It's an elaborate system for importing gas from North and West Africa, the United States, and elsewhere. So I think he wanted to ask a question, is that an opportunity more for Europe to look at for Germany? It ties into Germany's Energiewende and how they've been developing. And now have sort of had the Ukraine conflict as a catalyst to really push through legislation. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that. Is Portugal and Spain a good model for the rest of Europe to be looking at?
Sure. I would say that Portugal and Spain are a great model for you if you are like Portugal and Spain. That is to say, if you have a lot of sun, if you have a lot of land across which you can lay out solar panels and put wind turbines in installation. What I maybe didn't make clear, and it's partly connected to this question, is that, this notion of being captive to Russian gas, right, it's a kind of a new trend term, right, to be captive. But previously, it was considered a great wealth to have all of these pipelines coming through. Places like Spain and Portugal were at the other end. They didn't have that access. So they found a new solution, and they spent a lot of money, and energy was a lot more expensive for a long time because the taxpayer had to fund, the construction of those terminals. And on the notion of being captive to Russian gas too, I think a lot of people forget that Russian gas also floats around the world on ships. And then actually there was a study this summer that showed that, of the EU countries receiving the most Russian gas, curiously, for a point in time this summer, Spain and Portugal were actually receiving quite a bit of Russian gas. It's just that they were buying it on the open market, and it was arriving in a ship rather than, coming into Germany via pipeline. So I think that there are a lot of differences, and, countries are well aware. That's why I think in the Netherlands, they're reconsidering nuclear, because they don't have a lot of space to be able to build a lot of wind farms and solar farms to make that energy. And another important point just regarding renewables is that they can't really be, the electricity that they create can't really be stored, right? There are moments when it's very, very sunny, it's very, very windy, you'll get a lot in, the price will go down, maybe even sometimes going to negative, but you can't store it. They're hoping that they can do that soon with hydrogen or with, batteries. But natural gas and, to another extent, coal and oil, you can put it underground, put it in a barrel, keep it dry and on stock, and then power up the plant to run when you need it. That's kind of your base source. Renewables are flighty and fluctuating. So you can't really build an energy system based on something that's not dependable, shall we say.
I think I'll come back on screen since we seem to have lost Steve for a longer period of time. Are you back, Steve? It's here.
I can hear you. I wasn't going to turn my camera on in the hope that I would not be disrupted yet again. So apologies to both of you, and of course to our viewers for my intermittent appearances. I guess, you know, one of the other questions I had for you, America, related to this and related to just this reliability question, is whether you think there are any prospects that the Nord Stream 1 pipeline will go back online, or if that's not going to be the case, given this question of being held hostage by Russia being such a concern.
So I probably have a different opinion from a lot of people, but I will say that I noted with interest that when, you know, Russian President Vladimir Putin would speak, or his spokesperson, you know, Dmitry Peskov, it was never explicitly, we don't like you, we're going to turn off the gas. You know, it was, I don't want to use the word diplomatic, but it, you know, as in diplomacy, you know, there's always something over here we're talking about, which can serve as a good sort of excuse. And so, you know, it was first the turbines, right? Well, we've got a little problem with our turbines. And at times they would say, well, you know, if the sanctions issue were resolved, you know, maybe we could find some solution to this turbine. And that's still actually what I hear and what I see when I am consulting Russian media. They say, you know, well, we're going to do our best to get this online as soon as we can. So they keep that possibility open. Some would say, you know, that's just another attempt at, you know, injecting uncertainty and volatility into European markets. But one could also look at that and say, you know, the door is not definitively closed. But even if Nord Stream doesn't come on, a lot of people forget it's taken the place of the most important natural gas pipeline from Russia to Europe relatively recently. Most of the gas historically would come through the Ukrainian transit, you know, would come through pipelines, you know, through Poland and then into Germany. So there's nothing technically preventing today Russian gas from entering the European Union, full stop. Like, there are many routes that are open and not being used to maximum capacity, if at all. So that's one way to answer the question. Of course, the issue had always been for Germany and for Russia. One could argue that a shorter distance between 2 points is cheaper in terms of shipping gas. You don't have to pay any countries in between. So that was also a big attractive point, I think, for Germany, that it was direct. You didn't have to worry about whether Ukraine and Russia were at war with one another or other things. The Nord Stream 2 question is always kind of in the back of my mind. I started covering energy when Nord Stream 2 was almost complete. And for the past 2.5 years, it's been, will it be, you know, will it be completed in time? Will it not be? And curiously enough, they still have lawyers that are still fighting their long-running legal cases for the right to operate in the EU, and they're kind of winning. So curiously, you know, even though the shell company of Nord Stream 2 AG in Switzerland itself, you know, could teeter into bankruptcy, laid off all its staff, you know, the actual infrastructure and the, shall we say, the corporate juice behind the project is fully functional. So, you know, the pipeline is there. Physically, there's nothing stopping it from operating. And some would point out that if Russia wanted to send gas through the line, there's nothing that Germany could do to stop it. You know, the infrastructure regulator, the Bundesnetzagentur, could issue a fine for operating without permission. But it's been pointed out that the fine is, you know, several million euro, which would be much, much cheaper than the pure value of the gas going through the line. So there are a lot of people that are kind of wondering, watching, waiting. And just to finish I wouldn't say Nord Stream 2 conspiracy theories, but just the geek watchers, shall we say. There was a competition probe that took place in Poland, where they got a look at the confidential documents behind the company. And they noted, much to my interest, that the 4 or 5 Western energy companies, which put up each 10% of the cost of building the line, so OMV, NG, I want to say Uniper, and a few others, forgive me, they don't all come to my mind. So they each put up 10%. But according to the Polish Competition Authority, if ever Nord Stream 2 couldn't pay back the loan, the shares of the company would go to the ownership of these Western firms. So a kind of gamesmanship question has been, could there be a situation, where the company goes bankrupt or defaults on these loans? Technically, the company shares revert so that it's not owned by a subsidiary of Gazprom, but it's actually owned equally by Shell, etc. Would that suddenly make it politically acceptable to operate because it would be owned by Western European energy companies? It's probably longer than you wanted, but I just wanted to.
That is super interesting and gets us into the political dimension even more as well. And so as we wrap up, I guess one question I have for you is sort of about the political fallout or the potential political fallout of these rising energy prices and what you're seeing in terms of the mood across Europe when it comes to that.
I can't speak to the mood across Europe as far as the man on the street reporter is concerned. But what I can say is that in Brussels and in the capitals, the fear is that, the yellow vest movement, what we call the Gilets jaunes in France, or, the Dutch farmers, all those people who will perceive their difficulties this winter, heating their homes, being able to afford filling the gas tank in the truck to get to work, will increasingly say, hold on, why is this happening? It's because we said we wanted to be in solidarity with Ukraine, we wanted to sanction Russia, we're not physically declared as at war with Russia, but we are being pushed into a war economy. Is it worth it? And in a lot of these capitals, they're saying, if we don't get this right, if we don't fix this, not only will we be out of office at the next election, but those people replacing us will not be pro-EU and will not be willing to cooperate on these things in the future. Did that answer your question?
We may have lost Steve again.
Oh, all right.
I do have his script, so I'm aware that I think those were all the questions that we had hoped to ask you, although we do have a few more minutes, and if I could maybe ask you one more question. It's maybe a little off topic, but there have been some recent articles also in the New York Times here about the burning of wood pellets and the use of wood in Europe, and that it has been defined, over the last few years as a renewable energy, of course.
That's right.
But I think people are realizing and waking up to the issue that, well, yes, you can regrow trees and it's renewable in that sense. The amount of carbon dioxide released by it is huge and immense, and in some cases, I think I read worse than coal.
Yeah,
just curious, again, when we're looking at all of these issues about energy resources and what can be used, do you think wood is going to continue and the wood pellets is going to continue to be used, or is there now potential movement to say we actually can't be using that either? Where does that issue stand?
So this is actually another political hot button issue in Europe right now, because as you rightly pointed out, the EU has classified, I think they call it biomass. But the idea behind it being renewable is that, they don't want to promote deforestation, right? So don't clear cut and use all of that. But the idea is, well, if you're cutting down trees to make a cabinet and to make a desk, those little twigs, we'll call that renewable. And there's been a growing chorus of nonprofits over the years who have said, A, that's not really what's happening out there. B, when you burn it, it pollutes a lot. But it puts the European Commission in this bind because they've labeled it renewable. And then they have these targets every year on, what percentage of your energy mix is renewable. And, Energy Commissioner Kadri Simpson says this at each time. We rely on a huge percentage of that renewable target being met with essentially wood. So this is kind of one of those tug of wars between climate and between energy. And, it's not just the forest down the street, so to speak. I mean, I think even last winter, people were talking about all of the fossil fuels that were burned by getting wood pellets in the US on a steamer ship, over to Europe to then be burned and pretending that all of this is green, which it is not. But according to the magic formulas that have been put in place to decide this in the European Union, it's considered green. But even now, I think there are lawsuits that are being prepared wanting to take away that renewable status in Europe. So that is definitely something to watch. And even now, I mean, we talk about scarcity. I was at a party last night and I had a friend of mine say, I'm trying to buy a new house, but I don't know whether I should go for oil heating or gas, or those new wood pellet burning furnaces. Even the packet of wood pellets that you buy in the store has doubled in price in a lot of places here already. So as the contagion spreads from gas, people run to coal, then from coal they run to everything. So it's really having a knock-on effect. And I think the big fear is that even in the best case scenario, we'll make it through winter, but how indebted will our governments get? And will that create a sort of financial crash that will be a Lehman Brothers moment, but for the universe of Europe.
Let's hope we don't get to that moment. It's understandable that could be the next crisis that we're having to deal with. But America, I want to thank you on behalf of Steve, who we've unfortunately lost at this point, and the American Council on Germany for this really engaging conversation. My apologies to you and to our listeners that we had some of the technical issues, but I think at this point, after 2.5 years, we understand this happens from time to time, but you rolled with it really wonderfully, America. And I hope we can have you back in the future to talk about this issue. Hopefully things will improve, so we're not bringing you back to talk about more of a crisis. But thank you again for the time with us today. Really appreciate it.
No, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good rest of the day and evening. Bye-bye.